area. Elizabeth Farm, near Parramatta, New South Wales, embodies a two-room cottage of 1793, but its well-known appearance is of later date. Western Australia, founded in the year 1826, Victoria, unofficial settlers, founded in the year 1834, and South Australia, founded in the year 1835. In 1859, Queensland was also created. South Australia was the scene of the first mineral boom of all. Copper was discovered in the 1840s. Western Australia found a gold at Kalgoorlie and drew fortune seekers west from all over Australia and New Zealand. Some regions were dominated by a particular group such as Cornish miners. Some locations significant Chinese gold diggers from Victoria, Lutheran German farmers from South Australia, and French merchants from Sydney. The Roman Catholic Church in Australia, almost wholly Irish, grew strong and was more active and visible. Australia's first professional architect, Francis Greenway, spent a great deal of time supervising the making of bricks and mortar and in instructing bricklayers before construction of good quality could begin. Convict labor was widely used in New South Wales and Tasmania, but was usually unskilled and uncooperative. Gold rushes brought many skilled people and created wealth to make possible the import of whatever and whoever was needed. The very first railway lines were under construction before the discovery of gold, and the growth of major roads continued from the late 1850s. The most widespread species of timber in Australia is the eucalyptus, whose many varieties are all hardwoods. Some very dense, colors vary from yellow to deep red. Early settlers found the hardness and the need long seasoning, such as the toon tree, which is like a soft red cedar, the blue-black volcanic basalt of southern Victoria, the golden sandstone of the Sydney region, or the soft grey limestone, and the brown-black schist of South Australia. Galvanized iron arrived in 1850s. It was widely used. In New South Wales and Victoria, decorative iron was popular, but was displaced later by turned and fretted woodwork. Kauri pine, which was also exported to Australia in the early decades, has plentiful of supply. Until 1865, the value of Oamaru limestone for fine work was recognized. There are buildings which made to look like stone, the best known being the extensive four-story of government offices at Lambton Quay, Wellington, by which W. H. Clayton, colonial architect, 1874. After the first circumferent house in Sydney, 1788, the amount of building in the early years was limited both by the rigors of pioneer circumstances and by the constraints imposed by the home government. Nevertheless, in Macquarie Street, Sydney, two substantial pre-1810 buildings survive. They were original units of the first public hospital and were built between 1810 and 1817 by an architect whose identity is uncertain. The details are simple and coarse, but they have verandas in each of these two stories. The Australian summers warranted the use of architectural features. One of them was Lieutenant John Watts, who arrived in Sydney in 1814. He had been in Jamaica and turned his hand to architectural design several times. He was responsible for the military hospital 1814, of which portions still survive in the premises of the National Trust of New South Wales, and at the Parramatta for the alternative government house, the Lancer Barracks, and the Norman-style towers added to St. John's Church in 1818. In Australia in 1835, contributions to civil and military architecture were made by army officers. Their commander, Major George Barney, was responsible for many buildings. He provided the initial plans for two prisons, one at Darlinghurst, East Sydney, 1835 to 1841, which is still used today, and another one on Norfolk Island, 1835 to 1846. As New South Wales governor from 1809 to 1822, Lachlan Macquarie devoted a large portion of the state's mineral resources to the development of townships including Sydney, Parramatta, and 5 other new settlements. Francis Greenway was discovered among the convicts by Macquarie in 1814 and appointed civil architect. He had been in partnership with two of his brothers, Oliver and John, in a firm of architects, builders, and stonemasons. In 1812, Francis was found guilty of forging a memorandum of contract, and a death sentence was commuted to 14 years transportation to the penal colony. In the Sydney region, Greenway led the way to higher standards with well-designed and well-built official buildings. Though they were still simple and mostly of red bricks, in style, they are late Georgian of a domestic character. Australia is about the same size as the United States, approximately 4,000 kilometers or 1,250 miles across an island continent along with Tasmania. which is separated from the mainland by twice the distance that separates Ireland from England.
In early Tasmania, James Blackburn was one of the two outstanding designers. He was transported for forgery. S. George Church, Hobart, was begun by Archer in the Georgian manner in 1837, and Blackburn added an octagonal tower in 1847. The latter also helped Lady Jane Franklin with a Greek Revival Museum in Hobart in 1843. The history of architecture in New Zealand is similar to that of Australia, beginning with domestic-scale buildings. New Zealand was colonized 2 generations later than Sydney, and the impact of the picturesque and romantic was greater. New Zealand's most distinctive and recognizable buildings are the homesteads, especially in the Canterbury, Marlborough, Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, and Manawatu districts. The earliest homesteads are often rectangular in plan with upper stories contained within gabled roofs and naturally lit with large dormer windows. The second distinctive type of building in early New Zealand was the so-called Selwyn-style church, mostly to be found in and around Auckland. They were timber churches, the designs for which were developed jointly by Bishop Selwyn and Frederick Thatcher.
Did you know that James Blackburn was an ex-convict, but even though he was an ex-convict, he's still one of the outstanding architects in Australia in his time?
Joseph Reed in 1823 to 1890 of Melbourne worked in both the classical and Gothic styles and introduced polychrome brickwork and the Italian Romanesque style. He was a versatile architect who built up a large practice working with various partners, the first and long-lasting of them being Frederick Barnes. Reed's buildings are the Melbourne Public Library in 1854, the Geelong Town Hall in 1854, the Melbourne Town Hall in 1867, the St. Paul's Church of England Cathedral in 1884 to 90, the Church of the Sacred Heart, Bendigo, in 1886 with N.B. Tappin, and his best-known building in this style is the Independent Church in 1866 in Collins Street, Melbourne. James J. Barnett in 1827 to 1904 of Sydney was the longest-serving and most successful of the official architects in the Australian colonies. The architecture Barnett and his colleagues produced was competent neo-Renaissance in style, usually well-built in stone. His buildings showed little inclination towards the increased complexity and use of color, typical of contemporary private architects. Barnett's leading works in Sydney are the Lands Department, the Colonial Secretary's Department, the General Post Office in Goulburn, the Law Courts in Bathurst.
Did you know that James Barnett was responsible for more than 1,500 projects throughout his large territory?
William Wilkinson Wardell reached Melbourne in 1858. Already experienced both as an engineer and as an architect. From 1859, he was successively chief architect to the Department of Works, Victorian, and Inspector General before running a flourishing practice, chiefly carrying out ecclesiastical work such as St. John the Evangelist in Melbourne, St. John's College, Sydney University in 1858, St. Mary's Cathedral, Hobart in 1876, and St. Mary's Cathedral in 1865. John Horbury Hunt came to Sydney in 1863 from Boston, where he had trained under Charles Slipper and later under E.C. Cabot. whose practice consisted largely of country houses, in the vanquished picturesque style, as his master, and work of this kind is suburb, and country continues the major portion of Hunt's work in Australia. In addition to houses, Hunt was regularly involved with church buildings. The three largest were provincial Angelical cathedrals, the St. Peter's at Armidale in 1871 to 97, the Christ Church at Grafton in 1874 to 84, and the Christ Church at the Newcastle in 1885 to 95.
St. Mark's, Darling Point, Sydney in 1847 to 1875 was among the many churches Blackett did as diocesan architect, an appointment given to him in 1847. It was one of his first, probably the best situated, and now the best known. The exterior is rather severe, with tall and narrow lancet windows and shallow buttresses. An octagonal stone spire is carried on the three-story tower. The building has a pleasing interior with timber decorations. The tower and spire were added in 1872 to 1875. One of earliest buildings with pointed windows was the Amateur's First Catholic Cathedral of Sydney, St. Mary's, built in early 1820s and destroyed by fire in 1865. A few architects arrived with the early settlers. Prominent among them were William Mason and Frederick Thatcher, and a little later Mountfort, who arrived in 1850. Architects such as Verge, Blockett, and Reed were sometimes involved in the design of early terraces and villas, but in many cases, architects have not been identified for the numerous large suburban houses which testify to the post-gold rush wealth.
Did you know there was no experienced practitioner in Gothic Revival design in Australia until Blackett arrived in Sydney in 1842? He became responsible for about 40 churches. 40 churches? Unbelievable!
One of New Zealand's outstanding buildings is the Canterbury Provincial Council Chamber, Christchurch in the High Victorian manner. The initial chamber was constructed in timber by Mountfort and Block in 1858 to 1860. A substantial addition in stone by Mountfort alone was completed in 1865, the interior of which is regarded as New Zealand's finest of the period. Mountfort continued as diocesan architect through the 1970s and 1880s. His congregational church in Christchurch in 1874 to 1875 is an excellent example of the quality of his work.
Did you know? Mountfort is more obviously Gothic, but still owes much to its timber construction.
Australia's earliest building of a substantial kind was the first government house in Sydney in 1788 and 1789, the design of which is attributed to its bricklayer, James Blood's work. The same early bricks were first used experimentally in a one-room cottage for Bennelong, an Aboriginal who was befriended by Governor Phillip. This was Australia's first brick house. The Civil Hospital between 1810 and 1817 is a building from this early period in the heart of Sydney. It is uncertain who was the architect, referred to as the Mint. One of its later uses, it has now become a museum. After Greenway and Verge, the best-known early architect was Mortimer W. Lewis, colonial architect from 1835 to 1850. The courthouse at Darlinghurst, Sydney, for which he designed the central block, one of Australia's relatively few Greek Revival buildings.
Blackett resigned his post as colonial architect to undertake the commission for the University of Sydney 1854 to 1860. His scheme envisaged a range of buildings on four sides of a grassy quadrangle with academic accommodation on one side and the Great Hall on another. The academic wing is Tudor in style with handsome bay windows. A central entrance is marked with a pinated tower. The walls are stone-faced brickwork using the golden sandstone. of the Sydney region, which is good quality and well suited to carving. After Blackett, the largest commission for Gothic Revival buildings went to Wardell S. Patrick Melbourne, 1858, and S. Mary's Sydney, the largest of Australia's cathedral. The plan of St. Mary's is said to be based on Lincoln Cathedral, an interior elevation in Chartres Cathedral and the west front of Notre Dame in Paris. His detail is geometric Gothic throughout and richly decorated. One of the most successful Neo-Renaissance style building is the Treasury, Melbourne, 1857 to 1862, by Clark. The gold rush which began in 1851 created an urgent need for such a building. It is reminiscent of the style popularized by Barry, but there is a boldness in the 5-bay arcading within which the window edifices are deep terraces. The long and productive career in Australia of Cornishman Joseph Reed, 1822 to 1890, began with the Public Library, Melbourne, now the State Library of Victoria. He used a giant double-story Corinthian portico and pilasters elevated on pedestals. The detailing of edifices and of the capital is distinguished, as are some of the interiors. The main reading room of the library in the center of the complex is of 1911 to 1913, designed by Reed Smart and Tapin. James Barnett's General Post Office, Sydney, 1865 to 1874, 1881-1900, stands on a narrow site 118 m long. The design is generally Neo-Renaissance with handsome fenestration. The arcade has short granite columns on tapered pedestals and is almost medieval in character. The Lands Department, Sydney, 1876 to 1890, also by Barnett, is an elaborate Neo-Renaissance building near Circular Quay and was for a long time a landmark for approaching ships. It was one of the 3 major office buildings for the colonial administration in Sydney. The others were the Treasury by Lewis and the Colonial Office by Burnett.
Did you know that the leading non-Renaissance public buildings of New South Wales are work of the colonial architect of the day?